Okay, so we want to talk more about graphs and the transformations that we can have with them. So um, first of all, translation is moving your graph left or right. But because of signs, period, and amplitude, the translation is a little weird. But think about normally sine and cosine complete one full period or one full cycle on the interval 0 to 2 pi. So if you want to kind of show where this comes from, if you just solve this for x in each one of these, so if I added c and get bx equals c and divide by b, I get that instead of starting at 0 now, it's going to start at c over b. And if it normally ends at 2 pi, if I do the same thing, I would get c plus 2 pi divide by b, and I would get c over b plus 2 pi over b. And if you think about what we talked about in the first video, this is the period, and then this is where you started. And so now it translates now. It starts here and it ends here, and you get that one complete cycle, like the 5 key points, okay? So instead of calling it a translation, it's called a phase shift. And basically it starts where it starts at c over b. So that's what you need to know. I will say, notice, just like in a lot of our other formulas, we say that the original formula is bx minus c, so you always take the opposite sign of what's happening there. So minus is positive c, plus is negative c. So in summary with what we did yesterday, if you have some number plus a sine of bx minus c, or y equals some number plus a cosine of bx minus c, remember the amplitude is the absolute value of a. That's like the stretch or the shrink. The period is 2 pi over b. And the left and right endpoints of one cycle is when we solve this, right? That's where we got the c over b and the c over b plus 2 pi over b. Or just think about it's moving c over b units left to right. This is the phase shift. And I feel like I always don't talk about the D one, but we talked about that. We did that in the first part. This is just your vertical shift, right? Up or down that many units. So that's all the things that we can do to the graph, also reflecting it, I guess. So let's look at one. So it says find the amplitude of the period, the phase shift, and the vertical translation, and then find the max and min values. So I will tell you that Ivy Text likes to give you the questions like this, where it has all those blanks, right? They want you to find the amplitude. They want you to find the period. They want you to find the phase shift, the vertical translation, and they also want the max and the min. Okay? So this is where you got to know these formulas. The amplitude is the absolute value of A. A is right here, so this one is 1/2. That means it's actually going to be kind of compressed. It's going to be smaller than normal. The period is 2 pi over b, where b is the number in front of x. So on this one, it's 2 pi over pi, which means the period on this one is 2. The phase shift is the new one. That's c over b. So think about this as a cosine of bx minus c. So c in this one is 1, and b is pi. So that's going to be really weird, but that's the phase shift. The vertical shift is the number out here, and so that's a positive 4. So I'm going to say up 4 units. Think about, gosh, why does it make that noise and then mess up my voice? I don't know. Think about that the max and min for cosine, right? Cosine and sine are both always in between 1 and -1. So to find your max and min, this whole cosine value can't be bigger than 1 or smaller than -1. So to find your max and min, all you have to do is replace that with the max and min value, which is 1 and -1. And whichever one gives you the biggest value is the maximum. So for plus 1/2 is 4.5. And 4 minus 1/2 is 3.5. And so on this one, the max value is 4.5, and the min value is 3.5. So the lowest that graph's going to be is 3.5, and the highest is going to be at 4.5. Okay? Okay. So let's graph one. Where's my time? Okay. So negative cosine of 2 pi x. What I like to do is kind of look at it and see what's happening, find my amplitude, my period, and then I'm going to pick some points. Okay? So first of all, I see the negative in front, so remember that that means it's reflected, so it's going to look opposite over the x-axis. My amplitude here is the absolute value of -1, which is 1, which means it's not stretched any. But the period is 2 pi over b, or 2 pi over 2 pi gives me a period of 1. So this is where labeling your x-axis becomes really, really important. There is no phase shift here. There is no vertical shift, so I'm not going to write that part out. But this is where picking your points is so important, okay? So if this is your period and there's no phase shift, we always start at 0 if there's no phase shift, or you start at your phase shift, and we end at the period, which is 1. And if I want to take 5 points, my 5 key points, I'm going to take halfway in between, which is 1/2, and then halfway in between that, and then halfway in between 1/2 and 1 would be 3/4. Or if you add these two together, you always get that one. This becomes really important. This is how you get your points. So because there's pi in the problem already, that's why I don't have to put pi on my x-axis this time. And so if I label this, and you have to label at least every other one so I know what it's going by, you always want these to be equally spaced. And if you know your points, you can just do them. But if you don't, you can actually use your calculator, or you can plug it in. But if I plug in 0 here, I get cosine of 0, which is 1, but it's -1. I know the normal cosine starts at 1, ends at 1, and then the values of it. But you can use your calculator too. If you plug 1/4 in here, you're going to get pi halves. And cosine of pi halves is 0. And then normally cosine goes down to -1, but because of that negative in front, it's +1. This one's going to give me the 3 pi halves, which is back to 0. And then I'm going to end back where I started, right? If there's no vertical shift or no amplitude, then my y values aren't going to change much, right? So I'm going to label this as well. And then I'm going to make my points. So at 0 now, it's going to start down here. Then it's going to go to 0, up to 1, back to 0, and down. And remember that cosine is even, so it goes the same way on this side. And I get something like that. But if you don't label your x-axis, that's a really big deal, okay? So what about this one? Ivy Tech likes to give you ones that are a little bit harder than the ones that I just did. And so we're going to practice this one, and I have another one. We'll see how far I get. We might start this one and then finish it in class. But all these things, listing the period, the amplitude, the phase shift, the vertical shift, the max and the min. So on this one, the period is 2 pi over b. And b on this one is 4, right? So this is pi halves. The amplitude is the number in front here. There's nothing in front, so the amplitude's 1. The phase shift is c over b. C is pi thirds over 4, which is really pi twelfths. Do you agree with that? Yes? And the vertical shift, this one has nothing outside, so we're going to say 0 or none. And then the same way as before, my max and my min. If there's nothing going on outside here, right, what's the biggest sign can be? Well, the biggest is 1, and what's the smallest sign can be is -1. But if there's something going on outside, then that's when the max and the min are going to change. Okay? So let's think about picking my 5 points on this one. So since there's no since there is a phase shift, right? So normally we go from 0 to 2 pi, right? That's where I start and that's where I end. But I'm going to now start at my phase shift, right? So this is your phase shift, and you're going to end at your phase shift plus your period. Because if it's just 2 pi, then you end at that. So I know my ending point to get my 5 points is going to be pi 12ths plus pi halves. And you could do 1/12 plus 1/2 on your calculator, or I know that's going to be, why would I do 24ths? That's going to be 12ths. So then as 12ths times 6, so that would be 6 pi 12ths. So this would be 7 pi 12ths. Now this is where we got to be aware of some fractions here to get my 5 points. Halfway in the middle of that, right? Sometimes I think it's helpful to think about it as, like what, if I add, that's 6 pi 12ths. So halfway in the middle of that would be 3 pi 12ths or pi thirds. Right? Do you agree with that? If I'm at 1/12 to 7/12, that's a difference of 6/12. And I want to find the halfway point. And so 6/12, half of 6/12 is 3/12. And 3 pi 12ths is not pi thirds. Oh, what am I doing? Okay. Okay, so let's figure out what these points are, and this is where we'll start tomorrow.